Can you believe that an object, smaller than a modern metropolitan city, could single-handedly rewrite the history of an entire continent? That it could plunge the already struggling kingdoms of Britain into a darkness so profound, historians still fight over the scraps of what happened? This is not fiction. This is the forgotten history of the 7th century, the moment the sky itself declared war on the fragile world of men. And this is the story of the celestial beast that ripped the Dark Ages wide open. Imagine the year 626 AD. The echoes of vanished Rome still haunted Europe, but its laws and legions were long gone. Petty kings squabbled in the mists of what would one day be England, their power measured only by the sharpness of their iron swords and the loyalty of a few hundred warriors. Life was brutal, short, and illuminated only by the flicker of oil lamps and the constant, crushing dread of famine and war. They thought they knew fear. They were wrong. They were looking down, focused on the mud and the blood of their endless territorial skirmishes. They should have been looking up, because one night, high above the jagged black outline of the coastal hills, the very fabric of the cosmos ripped open without warning. It wasn't just a star. It was a dagger of pure, unholy light, carving a scar across the celestial sphere that grew brighter, longer, and more terrifying with every passing hour. This was the comet, the dreadful star, the beast of the night sky, and it was staring straight back at a terrified humanity, promising nothing but fire, ice, and ruin. The appearance of this monstrous celestial vagrant was so globally significant, so undeniably terrifying, that it was recorded with trembling hands by scribes separated by thousands of miles. In Constantinople, the Eastern Roman Emperor Heraclius saw it and immediately understood the stakes had been raised against his mortal enemies, the Persians. In the isolated monasteries of Ireland, chroniclers dipped their quills in terror, recording the event with the single chilling phrase, "The dreadful star appeared." But it was in Britain, where literacy was a luxury and superstition was law, that the comet was seen not just as an omen, but as the ultimate, unforgiving verdict from the heavens. Judgment Day had arrived, and it was trailing a tale of fire and plague across the moonless night. This was no mere astronomical curiosity for stargazers to catalogue. This comet, which haunted the night sky for weeks, months even, was a cosmic trigger mechanism, and it didn't just look scary. According to our deepest scientific and historical analysis, it actively did terrifying things to our world. The ancient records, the scant, desperate fragments of history we have left, speak of sudden, unimaginable cold, of the very air turning heavy and damp. They speak of the sun growing weak, shrouded in a permanent, sickly haze that stole the warmth from the earth. A catastrophe no one saw coming, yet everyone felt. Began not with a thunderous invasion or a massive flood, but with a dusting of invisible particulate matter raining down from the heavens, delivered by the icy breath of this celestial wanderer. We are talking about an apocalyptic climate shift, initiated by the impact debris and atmospheric disruption caused by this comet's close passage, plunging Western Europe and Asia, already teetering on the edge of civilization, into a decade of famine, plague, and chaos they were absolutely unprepared to handle. The crops failed catastrophically, not just in one season, but year after brutal, damp year. The brief growing summers, essential for survival in this precarious age, turned into prolonged, chilling, muddy depressions. The very growth rings of trees across Scandinavia and Europe tell a silent yet damning story. For the better part of 3 years immediately following the comet's fiery visit, the world essentially went into a chilling, starvation-induced hibernation. And while the skies were weeping ice and ash, the fragile political landscape of Britain shattered entirely under the pressure of starvation. The rising Christian power of Northumbria, the pagan fury of Mercia, all their carefully built treaties and alliances dissolved into a primordial soup of raw, desperate aggression. When people are starving, when the gods seem to have definitively abandoned them, the only constant is total war for dwindling resources. We are going to track this comet scientifically and mythologically across the globe, from the desperate battlefields of Persia, where it arguably changed the course of world religion, to the isolated monastic islands of Lindisfarne, where scholars tried to make sense of the new, terrifying reality. We will uncover how this single astronomical event may have been the silent, fiery hand guiding the sword of Penda of Mercia, the most feared pagan king of the entire British Dark Ages. Prepare yourself, because what you thought was a sleepy, forgotten corner of history is about to be revealed as a high-stakes cosmic thriller, a story of environmental collapse, mass starvation, and the terrifying realization that even the vastness of space holds grudges against mankind. This is the moment the British Dark Ages truly fell asleep, not into peaceful rest, but into the terrifying, feverish nightmare induced by a catastrophic visitor from the deepest reaches of the universe. This is Part 1. The Hook Earthquake. The nightmare was not confined to sleep. It was painted across the sky in burning sulfur and frozen gas, a monumental, terrifying signal that the rules of the universe had been drastically rewritten. When the sun set, it did not give way to comfortable darkness, but to an unnatural, shimmering terror that stretched from horizon to horizon. A cosmic sword drawn high above the heads of a world already buckling under the weight of ceaseless war and relentless plague. This was not a star, nor was it the gentle light of the moon. This was the Great Comet of 626 AD, an icy monstrosity that had torn its way through the deepest, coldest reaches of the Oort cloud, accelerating into the inner solar system like a rock hurled by an angry deity, destined to shatter the fragile stability of the 7th century. Imagine standing on the mighty, impregnable walls of Constantinople, the jewel of the Byzantine Empire, the last bastion of true Roman power, and watching this thing grow larger, brighter, faster, every single night for weeks on end, dominating the heavens with an unnerving, palpable sense of impending doom. The chronicles, sparse and feverish as they are, record the immediate dread that gripped the world, naming it a hairy star, a fiery broom sweeping away the world, an unforgettable spectacle visible to every eye from the deserts of Arabia to the windswept hills of Northumbria. The few remaining scholars debated arcane astronomy, but the common man prepared, quite simply, for the final judgment delivered from the celestial sphere. And judgment it certainly seemed to be. At this very historical inflection point, the great Emperor Heraclius was locked in a brutal, desperate, life-and-death struggle against the colossal might of the Sasanian Persians, the last great clash of ancient titans that would decide the fate of the entire Near East. The comet appeared to be staring directly into the eyes of the emperor himself, a celestial warning delivered personally, seeming to tilt the cosmic scales against the established order. But the true, deep horror was not just the overwhelming spectacle of the light, it was what the light foreshadowed, the unseen consequence that followed it like a ghost. Historians now call this catastrophic environmental shift the dust veil of the 630s, a period of rapid, devastating global climate collapse that followed terrifyingly close on the comet's heels, suggesting either an almost unimaginable near miss that scattered tons of atmospheric shading debris, or a massive, unseen fragmentation event that laced the upper atmosphere with icy particulates and dust. Either way, the cosmic visitor delivered the trigger for global winter, plunging the already stressed world into a prolonged, miserable twilight. Across the entire Eurasian landmass, from the plains of China to the forests of Germany, the sun began to dim. Not suddenly, but slowly, ominously, as if a thin, suffocating layer of smoke had been meticulously stretched across the very dome of the atmosphere. The daylight became wan, the shadows soft and unnaturally long, and the vital heat required to sustain crops began to catastrophically fail, plunging average global temperatures by measurable, ruinous degrees in the years that immediately followed 626 AD. This was not just a passing cold snap that required an extra blanket. This was the systematic, silent dismantling of the agricultural backbone that supported every remaining vestige of civilization, a cosmic attack on the delicate balance of temperate life, savagely reducing growing seasons and ensuring that the coming winter would not just be cold but lethal, and the ensuing spring would bring no real relief, only the grim promise of famine. When the essential yields of grain drop by 20 or 30%, the granaries empty almost instantly, and the crucial social contract, the promise of food for labor, of security for allegiance, evaporates into thin air. This is precisely where civilization dies, not in a loud, glorious, cinematic explosion, but in the miserable, shivering silence of a prolonged, repeated, failed harvest. Now, let us zoom in violently on the edge of the known world, the rain-swept, geographically isolated island of Britannia, a place that had already been brutally and suddenly abandoned by the Roman legions centuries before, and was currently fragmenting into dozens of hostile, tiny kingdoms ruled by ambitious, deeply pagan, and profoundly brutal warlords. For these newly emerging Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, the diminished light, the relentless rain, and the sudden biting cold were not abstract astronomical phenomena. They were immediate, tangible validation of their darkest, bloodiest beliefs. The Christian God recently introduced was clearly failing. The old pagan gods of winter, war, and blood, Woden, Til, and Thunor, were returning, hungry, and demanding continuous, violent sacrifice. The comet, that burning sword in the heavens, became their terrifying, undeniable banner. As food became agonizingly scarce, the only viable source of wealth, power, and ultimately survival became relentless, total war. You could not grow sufficient grain in the cold, dusty twilight. You had to steal it, seize it violently, and slaughter those who attempted to defend it. This celestial event, this dusty trigger delivered from the void, became the high-octane engine driving the era's ultra-violence. And in the heart of this fractured, freezing island, one kingdom began to rise with terrifying, unstoppable speed, fueled entirely by this new climate of desperation and bloodshed: the kingdom of Mercia. Its ruler, Penda, was already a name whispered in abject fear across the fractured lands, a pagan monster who seemed to thrive and expand only in the cold and the chaos that the heavens had so dramatically delivered. Penda did not pray for mild weather or plentiful harvests. He prayed for opportunities to kill and conquer, and the comet delivered them in droves. Every failed harvest was a recruitment drive for his relentless, savage army. Every shivering, deadly winter was a strategic advantage against the settled, struggling Christian kingdoms to the north and south. The comet of 626 AD was not just a historical footnote, it was the starting gun for the most violent, pivotal, and destructive century in British history. The moment when the dust veil descended and the ancient Anglo-Saxon world, already a place of shadows, truly fell into the deep, irreversible Dark Age. This is where the story shifts entirely from the cosmic spectacle to the human carnage it unleashed, the age when the great Christian kingdoms were nearly wiped out by the cold and the sword. Prepare yourselves, because the reign of blood is about to begin, and it will be brutal. The atmosphere did not just change its color, it changed its mind. In the wake of the celestial horror of 626 AD, the world began to slow, choking on the cosmic dust the great wanderer had dragged into our orbit, a ghostly shroud pulled across the face of the sun. The light of the sky grew thin, sickly, barely penetrating the thickening haze that clung to the upper atmosphere like a permanent, gray wound. It wasn't just winter, it was a cosmic refrigeration unit switching on, plunging the British Isles, already shivering on the edge of the known world, into a deep, unnatural freeze that lasted not months, but years. The historical records are chillingly consistent, murmuring of a climate anomaly that defies explanation, a massive dust veil event confirmed by ice cores and the stoic silence of ancient tree rings, all pointing to a sudden, dramatic drop in global temperature. The great kingdoms of men believed the heavens had delivered a verdict, but they had misunderstood the delivery mechanism. It wasn't just spiritual judgment, it was physical, material destruction delivered by the finest particles of space rock, acting as a planetary thermostat set irrevocably to dead cold. Suddenly, the carefully planned cycles of planting and harvest, the very rhythm of Anglo-Saxon survival, shattered. The seeds rotted in the perpetually damp, cold ground. The summers failed to arrive, offering only damp chill and persistent gloom, rendering the essential grain crops utterly useless. Famine descended with the silent, suffocating efficiency of the grave. And when the bellies of men empty, so too does their capacity for mercy. The Christian kings, the newly converted descendants of Roman legacy, had preached peace and salvation, but salvation meant nothing to a starving man clutching a short sword. The delicate balance of power, the precarious treaties established by the great King Edwin of Northumbria, the most powerful Christian ruler in Britain, snapped like dry kindling. His expansive authority was built on stable harvests and wealthy monasteries, all of which now stood exposed, hollowed out by the creeping cold and the gnawing hunger. This was the signal that the old, terrible gods had been waiting for. They demanded blood sacrifice and the destruction of the soft, new faith. And they found their champion, a man forged in the raw iron of ancient paganism and fueled by an almost pathological hatred for the cross, Penda, the terrifying king of Mercia. Penda was not merely a warlord, he was a force of nature, a living embodiment of the cold, brutal spirit of the comet's destruction. While other kings desperately prayed for warmth and food, Penda sharpened his axes and gathered the desperate, the dispossessed, and the utterly ruthless under his banner. His name, which means the one who tears, quickly became synonymous with terror across the Midlands. He understood the fundamental truth of the age. When the sky offers disaster, the strongest response is organized violence. While Edwin's granaries were emptying, Penda's armies were swelling, ready to march north and claim the spoils of environmental collapse. The stage was set for the defining conflict of the Dark Age collapse, a clash born directly from the cosmic chill. Edwin, the great Christian Bretwalda, the undisputed overlord of Britain, looked south and saw not just an enemy king, but the very manifestation of the devil rising from the cold earth. Penda, meanwhile, saw only weakness in Edwin's reliance on prayer and organized religion, a soft target ripe for the plundering. Penda formed an unholy alliance, joining forces with the Welsh king Cadwallon, a man who hated the Anglo-Saxons with a ferocity that bordered on madness, regardless of their faith. The alliance between the pagan Mercian and the Christianized but vengeful Welsh was a strategic masterstroke, uniting disparate forces against the common enemy, the rich, cold-stricken north. It was a coalition of sheer destructive power, mobilized by the widespread famine that the comet had authored. Edwin, weakened by the strain of sustaining his kingdom through 3 years of celestial-induced hardship, was caught off guard. His forces were depleted, his morale fractured by the constant fear that the gods had abandoned them. Penda and Cadwallon hit them with the ferocity of the cold wind itself. This was not a tactical engagement, it was an annihilation. The records are scarce, shrouded in the historical fog the conflict created, but the outcome is terrifyingly clear. Northumbria was utterly broken. The years that followed 633 AD were the true Dark Age in Britain, defined by the relentless, merciless campaigns of Penda of Mercia. He didn't just conquer territory, he systematically dismantled the Christian infrastructure, driving bishops into exile, burning churches, and reviving the ancient blood rituals of the pre-Christian era. He was the anti-Bretwalda, the ultimate destroyer, ruling over a land where the constant cold was matched only by the constant fear. The Comet of 626 AD had not just predicted the war, it had engineered the conditions, starved the victims, and unleashed the killer. The land lay fallow, soaked in the blood of kings, shivering under a sky that still seemed unnaturally dim, and Penda's reign of terror had only just begun. The great Christian dream was dead, and the darkness had come home to stay, invited by the silent, screaming celestial body that watched from the abyss. The celestial screaming had faded into an even more terrifying silence, a silence that settled over the fields of Northumbria and Mercia like a shroud of frozen ash. The year 627 AD should have brought recovery, a chance to rebuild the shattered faith in the shattered kingdoms, but instead, the sky itself had betrayed them. This wasn't just a matter of poor harvest. This was an unprecedented environmental catastrophe engineered by forces beyond human comprehension. The true, slow, agonizing punch of the cosmic visitor. The comet had not just passed by, it had left a toxic calling card in the atmosphere. Scientists today, staring back through ice cores pulled from the frozen heart of Greenland and Antarctica, have found the undeniable geological proof of this cosmic assault. A massive sulfuric acid spike, a band of white terror etched permanently into the ice layers dating precisely to the mid-620s. This wasn't local smoke. This was stratospheric dust, high above the clouds, reflecting the sun's vital energy back into the void. The world was placed under a permanent dimmer switch, shrouded in a perpetual sickly haze. Imagine waking up every day, not to the gold fire of the rising sun, but to a pale, milky orb, weak and struggling, barely penetrating the perpetual fog that hung over the British Isles. The temperature plummeted, throwing the fragile agricultural systems of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms into complete disarray. The crops withered on the vine. The grain stores, already depleted by years of relentless warfare and internal strife, vanished into the gaping maw of famine. Chroniclers, huddled in freezing monasteries, wrote not just of cold, but of a profound sense of despair, describing the sun as being darkened for a year, a terrifying sign of the end times made manifest in the lack of warmth and life. This was the perfect breeding ground for a man like Penda. While the Christian kings, like the newly risen Oswald, were busy praying for salvation that never seemed to arrive, Penda was capitalizing on the chaos, leveraging the widespread starvation and terror to consolidate his barbaric power base. Penda of Mercia, the ultimate pagan warlord, didn't need a harvest. He needed warriors, and famine provided them in droves. Desperate men, abandoning a god who seemed to have abandoned them first, flocked to the banner of a leader who promised immediate, brutal survival, often gained at the expense of his softer, starving neighbors. Every raid he launched into Wessex or Northumbria, every monastery he sacked and burned for meager supplies, was a silent confirmation of the comet's message. The old ways, the savage ways, were the only ways left to survive the cosmic winter. The dust veil wasn't just a physical barrier, it was a psychological hammer blow. Imagine the pervasive, grinding fear when the seasonal cycles, the bedrock of human civilization, and the very promise of life, simply stopped making sense. Spring was cold, summer was gray, and autumn brought nothing but skeletal fields and biting winds. The collective trauma of watching the world slow down, of the earth itself refusing to bear fruit, drove the surviving populations to extremes of superstition and violence. People saw the pale sun as a dying eye, watching them suffer, judging them for some unknown cosmic crime. Monks recorded unusual natural phenomena, the sky turning strange shades of yellow and sickly orange at dawn, the air heavy with an unseen particulate matter, making breathing difficult and casting a perpetual, suffocating shadow over all hope. This slow, insidious freezing, this sleep-inducing darkness, was the true, lingering legacy of the 626 comet. It didn't destroy instantly. It poisoned the well of life and hope, guaranteeing the continuation of the bloody Dark Age conflict for another generation. The economic collapse that followed the climate shock meant that resources became hyper-localized and aggressively guarded. Trade routes, already perilous due to brigands and war, dried up completely, isolating communities and forcing a brutal return to self-sufficiency through outright conquest and pillaging. Mercia, geographically situated, perhaps suffered slightly less initially than the northern coastal plains, or perhaps Penda was simply more ruthless in extracting what little remained from the earth and from his victims. Whatever the reason, his power grew exponentially while his Christian rivals withered in the cold. Northumbria, the former golden standard of Anglo-Saxon Christianity, was forced into a desperate existential struggle, fighting the starvation within its borders and Penda's iron fist from without. The comet had provided Penda with his ultimate weapon, famine and the crushing weight of existential terror. The great dreams of King Edwin, the vision of a unified Christian Britain under a single benevolent banner, lay dead in the mud, frozen solid by the comet's icy breath. The fragmentation of the island into fiercely competitive, desperate kingdoms was complete and irreversible. Penda's armies moved with a relentless efficiency born of hunger, not just strategic genius. They didn't just defeat their enemies, they devoured their resources wholesale. When Penda marched, it was a sweeping, ravenous tide, leaving scorched earth and empty, haunted settlements behind. It is the ultimate historical irony. The spectacular sight of the comet, which terrified the learned monks and kings as an omen of divine wrath and Christian judgment, ended up being the perfect environmental catalyst for the survival and ascension of the most dedicated pagan king the British Isles would ever know. He was the Antichrist figure of the age, validated not by holy prophecy, but by hard physics and the distribution of cosmic dust. The climate shift validated the primal need for aggression and territorial defense, perfectly aligning with Mercia's bloodthirsty ethos. The deep, lingering cold permeated everything. Even if the sun eventually started to burn brighter, the psychological scar remained. The people had seen the sky turn against them, and that knowledge was more chilling than any winter frost they had ever known. This was not a quick storm that passed in a season. This was half a decade of grinding environmental stress, slowly strangling hope and breeding generations accustomed only to violence and deprivation. The Dark Age was officially cemented thanks to a few tons of interplanetary debris suspended miles above their heads. The British landscape itself seemed to mourn, blanketed in a dull gray pallor, mirroring the despair in the eyes of the surviving population, who had learned a terrible, bloody lesson. When the heavens speak, they rarely speak of peace. The 630s dawned as a decade of grinding attrition, where every grain of barley and every pound of meat was paid for in blood. The silent celestial architect had successfully reset the geopolitical stage, plunging Britain deeper than ever into the abyss. The only light was the cold, harsh reflection of steel on the battlefield, wielded by men who had nothing left to lose and everything to hate. The ultimate survival test had begun, and the world was watching, shrouded in dust. The silent screaming continued, echoing not in the sky, but in the empty stomachs and frozen hearts of the Anglo-Saxons, as Penda prepared his next, inevitable and blood-soaked move against the last bastions of Christian resistance. The stage was set for the final, brutal confrontation, a clash of ideology, faith, and sheer desperation, all orchestrated by the cold, distant hand of the comet. The comet was gone, vanished back into the cosmic blackness, completing its celestial transit, but it left behind a calling card that would choke the very life out of the continent. It wasn't just a fleeting spectacle of light, it was a high-velocity payload delivery system. High above the fragile, failing atmosphere, the residual orbital debris, the microscopic soot, and the silicate dust began its slow, deadly descent, altering the fundamental fabric of existence for every person below. This was the infamous 626 dust veil, a terrifying, silent assassin that history often forgets, overshadowed by larger volcanic eruptions. It was the physical manifestation of the celestial curse, settling upon the green earth like a colossal, invisible shroud of ash, immediately dimming the very source of light and life. The sky itself had been subtly, dramatically changed, losing that vibrant blue intensity that signaled warmth and abundance. Look at the silent witnesses, the ancient trees, still rooted today. If you could slice open the oak of the 620s, you would see the terrifying truth etched into its very core, a sudden dramatic narrowing of the growth rings that screams starvation and climatic shock. The summer of 627 AD never truly arrived. The dust layer, suspended high in the stratosphere, acted like a colossal planetary filter, bouncing back the critical solar energy needed for photosynthesis and growth. Temperatures plummeted, often dropping significantly during the crucial growing months, and harvests failed universally across the British Isles and continental Europe, a synchronized agricultural disaster that respected no border or creed. In the fledgling Christian kingdoms of Wessex, Northumbria, and East Anglia, the carefully stockpiled grain meant for evangelism, feeding monks, and funding expansion was now critically rationed. Food security collapsed, fueling internal resentment, mass sickness, and rapid political weakness. When the crops die, political stability and the morale of the populace die even faster, proving the old pagan beliefs in the capriciousness of nature absolutely correct. But for the pagan warlords lurking in the deep, untamed forests, this catastrophic climate shift was not a curse. It was a gift, a bloody opportunity delivered from the heavens. Famine is the greatest recruiter, and desperation breeds ruthlessness, the very elements upon which the ultra-violent cult of Woden and the old Saxon gods thrived. Enter Penda, king of Mercia, the last great, true pagan champion of England, whose legend is forged in the fire of countless ravaged monasteries and the widespread starvation of his enemies. Penda was not interested in converting or negotiating with the weak Christian kings. He saw only weakness where they saw divine punishment and a call to prayer. Penda possessed the terrible, brutal insight that mattered most in this new dark reality. He understood that if he could maintain supplies, if he could raid ruthlessly enough to feed his core band of loyal, terrifying warriors, he could leverage the widespread suffering of his neighbors into an unstoppable military force. The comet's cold, dark ghost was now Penda's shield, his divine justification. While his Christian rivals were praying for rain, warmth, and a return to prosperity, Penda was sharpening his axes, performing blood rituals, and mobilizing armies drawn from the hungry, the desperate, and the religiously zealous who saw the Christian God as having abandoned them. The year 632 AD marked the true turning point, a date historians often cite as the lowest point of the early Christian mission in Britain since the first Saxon invasions. Penda launched his initial devastating campaign against East Anglia, a crucial Christian stronghold, specifically targeting its wealthiest centers of faith and food storage. This was not a war of territorial gain or political maneuvering. It was an apocalyptic war of religious extermination designed to shatter the fragile psychological hold that the new Roman religion had on the populace. Churches were not just conquered, they were systematically burned to the ground. Monasteries were sacked for the last vestiges of food, and the peaceful symbol of the cross was replaced dramatically and violently with the thunderous roar of pagan fury. But the most shocking blow, the true testament to the chaos unleashed by the comet-induced climate famine, came at the infamous Battle of Hatfield Chase in 633 AD. King Edwin of Northumbria, the powerful Bretwalda, overlord, who had successfully unified much of Anglo-Saxon England under the banner of the cross, faced the combined terrifying might of Penda of Mercia and the fiercely anti-Saxon Welsh king Cadwallon. Imagine the immediate, shattering psychological impact on the remaining Christian communities. The greatest, most successful Christian ruler, anointed and protected by the newly established Church of Rome, killed under a still dimmed, cold sky. This catastrophic failure proved to the terrified, superstitious populace that the old gods, the powerful gods of storms, war, and the hunt, were finally, definitively victorious. The cosmic omen had delivered its promise of utter destruction perfectly. Northumbria, the former beacon of hope, immediately fractured. The unified kingdom dissolved almost overnight back into petty, warring, cannibalistic principalities, each vying desperately for survival in a land now gripped simultaneously by deep cold, pervasive famine, and Mercian raiders. The roads, once secured by Edwin's peace and trade, became impassable ways for only raiders and starving, desperate refugees. This wasn't merely a political setback or a temporary military loss. It was a total societal regression. The structures of literacy, organized trade, and formalized governance, painstakingly built over decades of Roman influence, crumbled in mere months under the catastrophic weight of the environmental collapse driven directly by the comet's residue. We left the world shivering, stunned by the celestial hammer blow of 626 AD, the moment the silent architect initiated the most brutal era of English history. But the initial shock of the omen, the sheer terror of that fiery trail across the sky, was nothing compared to the slow, agonizing stranglehold of the aftermath. The air itself turned against humanity, transforming the promise of spring into a perpetual, chilling twilight. This wasn't merely a bad stretch of weather or a localized drought. This was atmospheric warfare, a colossal global curtain drawn across the sun's face, trapping the planet in a cold, unforgiving grip that lasted not weeks, but years. The historical effects were instant, devastating, and irreversible, proving that the comet's passage was far more than just a psychological marker. Researchers today, peering through the frozen layers of Greenland ice cores like detectives reading an ancient murder scene, have seen the devastating evidence written in stone, or rather in sulfate. A massive, undeniable spike in atmospheric pollutants, a chemical fingerprint of global catastrophe, coinciding perfectly with the years 626 through 630 AD. This immense veil of dust and volcanic ash, either stirred up by the comet's close passage or related to massive seismic activity it may have triggered, acted like a dirty lens. It filtered out the vital solar energy needed for photosynthesis, the very engine of life on Earth. The light levels dropped, and with the light, the temperatures plummeted, creating a catastrophic micro-ice age that gripped Europe and Asia simultaneously. The consequences for the fragile, agrarian societies of post-Roman Britain were immediate and absolute. Harvests failed, not just reduced or stunted, but utterly destroyed, year after terrifying year, leaving granaries empty and bellies hollow. The historical records, sparse and chilling as they were in this deep, cold twilight, speak only of famine so profound, so wide-reaching, that desperate people ate tree roots, scavenged bark, and resorted to unspeakable acts just to survive another hour in the cold light. In the fragmented, violently competitive patchwork of petty kingdoms across what we now call England, the warring states of Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, and East Anglia, the already thin veneer of fragile Christianization and nascent civility instantly evaporated under the pressure of starvation. When the food ran out, diplomacy ended. This extreme pressure was the exact catalyst needed for the old, savage, vengeful gods of the Northern European tradition to roar back into the massive vacuum left by the struggling, famine-stricken Christian missionaries. The desperation demanded a return to ferocity, not forgiveness. Penda's rise was explosive, meteoric, fueled by the desperation of his people, the chaos of the climate collapse, and his own relentless strategic savagery. He understood that in a world starved of resources and hope, the only currency that truly mattered was terror and overwhelming force. His primary target, Edwin of Northumbria, the great Christian king, the man who had briefly managed to unite vast swaths of Britain under the banner of the cross, symbolizing the fleeting hope of peace and order that the comet had come to destroy. The clash was inevitable, a theological and political collision that the cosmos itself seemed to orchestrate. The ensuing conflict, culminating in the horrific Battle of Hatfield Chase in 633 AD, was not merely a defeat for Northumbria, it was a devastating spiritual execution. Penda, allied with the powerful, ferocious Welsh king Cadwallon of Gwynedd, absolutely annihilated Edwin's forces in a single, bloody afternoon. Penda's victory echoed the chilling celestial message of 626. The old, brutal ways were fundamentally stronger. The tentative Christian light had been extinguished by the cold, dark breath of the cosmos, ushering in decades of relentless, internecine warfare. Penda's reign of terror solidified the very darkest phase of the Dark Ages. For nearly 3 decades, until his eventual death at the Battle of Winwade, he acted as the unstoppable scourge of the Christian faith, systematically dismantling the hard-won gains of Augustine's mission, ensuring that the fragmented island remained perpetually at war, forever scrambling for dwindling resources under that sickly, dying sun. The silence from the heavens was utterly deafening, broken only by the screams of the hungry and the ceaseless metallic clang of steel on shield. Britain had not just fallen asleep during its Dark Age, it was trapped in a cold, inescapable, bloody nightmare, meticulously curated by a silent visitor from the edge of space. The year 627 AD did not bring relief. It brought a silence heavier than any snowfall. The skies above Britain, the very dome under which kings fought and priests prayed, were no longer blue. They were the color of tarnished bronze, perpetually bruised by an invisible, microscopic assassin. This was the comet's secondary, slow-motion strike, the atmospheric phenomenon known to modern science as the dust veil. It was not a sudden apocalyptic explosion, but a prolonged, insidious suffocation of the Earth's vital systems. Imagine waking up every day to a world operating on a dimmer switch, where the sun was nothing more than a pale, watery disk, offering light but withholding the fundamental warmth necessary for life to thrive. The solar irradiation levels plummeted with devastating consistency. The very energy that drove the cycle of harvest and rebirth was being systematically filtered out by tons upon tons of pulverized cosmic debris suspended impossibly high in the stratosphere. The consequences were immediate, predictable, and utterly catastrophic for the already fragile, decentralized societies clawing their way through the British landscape. The grain failed. Not just in one region, but across the entire island, from the struggling Christian outposts of Northumbria down to the pagan strongholds of Wessex and Mercia. This wasn't just a tough winter, this was the systematic eradication of summer itself, a global climate catastrophe engineered by a space rock. The years 627, 628, and 629 became a terrifying trilogy of starvation. When people lack food, they turn on their neighbors with a savagery that war alone cannot inspire, stripping the veneer of civilization with chilling speed. The hunger did not unify the kingdoms, it accelerated their cannibalization. The strong consumed the weak, driven by the primal, burning agony in their stomachs. And into this vacuum of despair stepped the man who would define the terror of the mid-7th century, Penda, the ferocious king of Mercia. Penda was not merely a warlord. He was the physical manifestation of the comet's chaos, a king forged in the ashes of failed harvests and the terror of astronomical omens, utterly ruthless and perfectly adapted to this new, cold world. While others struggled desperately to feed their shrinking populations, Penda harnessed the ensuing desperation. He utilized the collapsing agricultural base as a weapon, marching his armies through lands already weakened by famine and diseases that often follow mass malnutrition like scavenger birds circling a dying beast. His pagan kingdom, already steeped in a philosophy of immediate, violent survival, seemed oddly immune to the psychological collapse that plagued the Christian kings who sought divine intervention that never came. The psychological toll of the dust veil was immense. For 3 agonizing years, the sky had been an active, malevolent participant in their tragedy, first with the blazing sword of the comet, and now with the suffocating blanket of dust that refused to dissipate. Every cloudy day was an extension of the divine punishment, a cold, lingering reminder that the celestial entities were still watching, still judging, and still destroying. The Anglo-Saxons were steeped in fatalism, believing their destiny was inextricably linked to the whims of Woden and the terrible signs written in the heavens. When the sun did manage to break through, it was too weak, too yellowed, offering no true warmth or hope, only a sinister reminder of the cosmic debris still circling their world like a predatory bird refusing to fly away. Modern geologists, peering back through ice core samples extracted from the deep silence of Greenland and Antarctica, have found the undeniable signature of this cosmic intruder locked away in layers of ancient frozen time. Layers of volcanic ash are often visible in the core samples, but in the specific stratigraphy corresponding to the early 630s, there is an anomalous, unmistakable spike of sulfur aerosols and microscopic metallic dust, fragments ripped directly from the comet's icy, speeding heart. This wasn't just Earth's bad luck, a minor volcanic hiccup. This was the lingering ghost of the 626 AD passage, the pulverized remnants of a cosmic entity that shattered as it rounded the sun, leaving its deadly calling card indelibly marked in our atmosphere for years to come. Imagine billions of tons of ancient, cold space rock and ice, vaporized and then reconstituted into a fine powder, floating 15 miles above your head, systematically starving your children and chilling your very bones. The constant, grinding cold forced populations to retreat further into localized, highly defensible, often antagonistic settlements. Trade routes, already shattered by incessant warfare and brigandage, became completely unsustainable under these brutal weather conditions. Why risk a dangerous journey spanning weeks to trade for grain that simply didn't exist, or worse, to fall into the hands of Penda's starving, merciless raiders? The Dark Age was not just politically dark. It was literally shivering in the cold, economic dark, collapsing inward upon itself. The centralized Roman infrastructure, which relied entirely on reliable harvests and predictable seasons, was now just a crumbling, moss-covered memory, mocked by the perpetual twilight and the frozen earth. And as the cold persisted, the brutal reign of the pagan kingdoms intensified. Every raid, every massacre, every stolen goat was a direct consequence traced back to the moment that flaming sword tore across the constellation Cygnus. The comet had set the stage for total war based on desperation, ensuring that survival, not salvation, was the only currency that mattered. Britain was not just trapped in a nightmare, it was frozen solid inside it, waiting for the celestial clock to finally tick past the shadow of 626 AD, if such a time would ever truly arrive. The waiting was the worst. It wasn't merely the cold that killed the hopes of the survivors. It was the chilling, stark realization that the sun, the literal source of life, order, and warmth, was defeated. For 2 agonizing years, the celestial architect of terror, the Great Comet of the 600s, had dimmed the world. But the legacy of its shadow was permanent, institutionalized into the soil itself. The established powers, the fledgling Christian kingdoms clinging desperately to the spiritual memory of Rome and the stability of the Church, looked to the heavens for salvation, praying for the return of the life-giving star. Instead, they found only a mocking, sickly yellow-gray expanse that promised only perpetual twilight and suffering. When the crops failed for the second harvest in a row, sinking the reserves of entire regions into starvation, the whispered fears of divine judgment turned into theological screams. The powerful bishops, the keepers of the sacred flame that Alfred would much later claim saved England, were rendered utterly powerless against the cosmic winter. Their organized prayers yielded only frost. Their sermons were drowned out by the gnawing, animal hunger that drove men to acts previously unthinkable, shattering the already fragile veneer of civilization that had been so painstakingly, agonizingly built since the withdrawal of the legions centuries prior. The sacred omens, the cross, the relics, they had failed.